more money, I think, to put towards the development of that. And they didn't, and that in some ways was helpful, but that also kind of added this other thing. So you're constantly trying to weigh what are the benefits of this and how, what your relationship is with that entity, and also what you are hearing and knowing about the financial markets. Because I know a lot of people think that the public funding and the public things coming in are, there's a lot and they're relatively free. I have to think about the fact that over the next 85 years, I have a relationship with this entity, whoever they are. And is the programming going to work, and what are they going to be about, and what's going to happen in year 84 or 83 when that transaction happens, and how do we think about that, right? So it's never exactly free. Public money is never free. You have to do certain things along the way. And strangely, those requirements can change over time and what they require and what they do. Not even to the point of where you're contracting. After they contract, they may require additional things. And I know that from other projects that I worked on. And are you able to deliver on what they are requiring? And are you comfortable with some of the risks that they may put on you? The one thing I would say is ultimately, I can make some decisions. Ultimately, in these projects, it's actually the financial investor who is this unknown entity as you're entering into these transactions who actually have the biggest amount of say, because they're actually the bank who's loaning 50% of potentially the money into this, the equity investor, if you're using low-income housing tax credits, because they're putting all this money in. And there were times in this transaction that we were so deep into it that I was like, I really have no say in this. But you have to kind of know that going in, because you're thinking longer term. My time frame for all these projects and thinking through are strangely, I'm thinking out like a 20, 25-year time frame, which is longer than I'll be at the PDA, but that gets us through the tax credit period when the equity, when the investors exit. And you have to be thinking that far out in some ways. You're not going to have all the answers. You may have to make decisions in the short term that are going to be painful 7 years down the way, or 10 years down the way, but that's kind of like how you got to be thinking. It's not the short-term thing, and it's never free.
And
I don't know, Kristen, if I answered your question.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, are you going to
Yeah.
share your secret for how you're still going to be around at the end of the 85 years as well that you?
Well, that is kind of the joke, right? With the partnership, like, my partner in this is Chris Persons, and part of that I think is like relational. So I think we're getting into that. But you know, some of these things were like, so we're going to hit a major decision point in year 7. I'm like, shit, Chris, aren't you retiring in like 6 years or something? Because I mean, he's getting older, right? He's not older than me, but I'm just like, and he's like, ha, 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 right? And so you got to think both of the individuals, those individual relationships, but organizationally where they're going to be in a few years. I'm not going to be around in 85 years. I know where the previous executive director of the SCIDpda lives. We're still friends. And it's not uncommon for me to call her and be like, why'd you do this? And she's like, yeah, I'm so sorry, but that's the only way we could get things moving. So I had enough thought that the people in my job in 10 years will be able to deal with the situation. I wish I would have written a letter to you and told you, yo, you're, 5 years before this, read this. But that also gets lost, and you're just hoping for the best in some ways. It's a leap of faith. I hate to say it.
How do you feel, sort of describing, right? Like you have a relationship with Chris, and does that, and which, generates a certain level of kind of the partnership conversations. How does that end up translating into documents when it's not it's not an agreement between Maiko and Chris, it's an agreement between SCIDpda and Community Roots? And can you talk a little bit about sort of negotiating those partnership agreements and those really, sort of how that works, because you do have to think about, you're reliant on the relationship that you have to get through the negotiation, but yeah, you in essence are negotiating for, people in the future.
So I told you, I already mentioned that I knew that this RFP was going to come out and we weren't going to be the most competitive for this land at Seattle Housing Authority. So I had to think about how to make myself more competitive. I needed a balance sheet. I needed more recent experience. And I thought that if I did something with a fellow PDA, a somewhat similar organization, that would probably be more comfortable, um, because they would understand the weird quirks that we have. Um, and so I had already been thinking months in advance of this RFP coming out, like who I could partner with, and been having organizations. So it's not just me making the decision too, right? It's a whole conversation with my board, and my board is changing every year. I get new board members. So it's like, how do you manage that as well? But it had been a conversation with my board early on about, I'm going to have to partner with somebody. I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to have to do that. Who are we comfortable with? What does that look like? How do we be most successful? And I knew a little bit about who was not coming in to who's going to apply, just because I happened to meet them in a bar in Columbia City, just a random meeting, right? And so that's why I think knowing that this is coming up, and I knew it was coming up for probably about a year, just in those random conversations, is just to get a sense of who you're thinking and who your competition was on this. Um, and so when the RFP came out, we entered into this partnership because I sent a text to Chris Persons and said, "Yo, it's out. Want to join?" And he's like, "Sure." So that's how that started. The challenge, Kristen, that you mentioned is sometimes I have conversations up here, which is more like an ED to ED, and how that filters down to staff. Um, our organization is smaller than his, so easy for us to have that communication, maybe a little bit more challenging on their side. And his staff, the staff may not understand the relational issues that Chris and I have. So it is that me talking with the staff and hearing and having to constantly communicate up this way within the organization. So this is me and Chris, this is staff. Staff are working this way. If there's an issue, it needs to be floated up. And how does that work? And so it's a lot of conversation. It's much harder to do things in an agreement like this than not. And so that's why if given the opportunity, it's better to do it with somebody that you have a working relationship with, that you can base this relationship on, because I have entered into at least a 17-year relationship with this person in this organization. So how do you translate that? And so that is the constant, okay, as we're looking at this agreement, it's not what happens, Michael, if your future replacement is a wackadoodle and you can't perform. Okay, that needs to be noted in here. Okay, Chris, what if I hate your organization in 3 years? What does this look like, right? And all of this. And so you try to lay that out as best as possible, knowing that with the best intent you're going into it, but knowing that these documents are coming out at the worst of times. And then this thing gets floated up to an investor who's like, I don't like any of it. And so it's a constant communication. It's meetings forever, and it's some real gut checks. And then it's also having good, I really appreciate my lawyer in this, and just like, okay, tell me this document, when is it coming out? And she will tell you it's coming out at the most shittiest times ever. So let's make this as hard as possible. And you're constantly learning through these things. So there's things that she learned on her last deal that's bringing forward. And that's something else I want to touch on, is that people are always bringing with them their past experiences, good and bad. And so having the space and the time to have those conversations is really important. It's just oftentimes in the midst of a real estate transaction, you don't have that time. And
And
that's tough.
you've mentioned two pieces that sort of tie to how the role of the investor who's coming with their money and sort of
Yeah.
getting to have a say, and that, reaching out to community roots had to do with balance sheet. And so I know one of the pieces we've talked a lot about in this group is sort of how does the influence of being the big pocket play into your role, your sort of power within those negotiations, and wonder if you can talk a little bit about, how that's come into play, if at all.
Well, it has. So much like there's developers, much like in every bucket of people that you classify in this way, there's a whole range of them. You just might not know what that range is yet. And so um, both of these projects are being developed under COVID, and COVID is a weird time. And the processes by which we chose an investor for Yesler Family is probably going to be different than at North Lot. Um, at Yesler Family, we went out with an RFP, which Community Roots typically does, and there was one investor and one group, and they basically made it known that we know that we're your only investor, and we're here not because of SCIDpda, we're here because of Community Roots, and specifically because a member of their staff, and there was a member of their staff that was part of that knows somebody over there at the investor. And so they made it pretty clearly known that we're not here. We really, SCIDpda, you're cute, but you in our minds have no capacity and no ability to pull this off, and don't even think that you can do this. And then they saw our balance sheet, and we do have a bit of a balance sheet. I mean, we've been around for 45 years. We've got 4 projects. We own 4 properties, and they're like, oh, you know what a balance sheet is. You know what a balance sheet is, and here it is. And oh, it looks good, right? And so you end up with these investors sometimes that don't know you. Um, the the other project, we're probably going to end up going with an investor that's more mission based and has known us much longer. You may not get the best pricing, but in this world right now, when you're looking at COVID stuff, it's a little wacky. And our project is big, which limits the numbers of investors. It gets complicated because we have other entities. That limits the number of investors. And we had a past investor at a previous project that changed dramatically. We went with the best pricing, and this was back, I think, started in the 90s, and they were an energy company. And along the way, they changed the terms of the deal when they started running out of money and didn't need the benefits. So it is, do I have a choice in an investor? And if I do, who do I go that's probably going to be the best fit for me long term? And when I don't have that investor, there are decisions that they want and that they're going to mandate on you. And I have to be comfortable with whether or not I was good with it. So I put on the slide that I was 51% owner. The investor told me that I didn't have the experience or the capacity to make decisions. So they want Community Roots to be in that decision-making position. That made Community Roots very uncomfortable because that they felt that that changed the values of how we entered the transaction. And so we had to then push back. Okay, well, I understand that you're comfortable now. How do we revisit the comfort? How do we do this? And not even sure how that's going to last long term. Um, and then it's legally understanding, again, Kristen, like at what point are these provisions called forward?
Mhm.
And is it really a risk that I can manage or am willing to do, right? And to like, there's a document that Community Roots had to sign for the childcare, and they were really uncomfortable. And in talking with the attorney said, for this document to come into play, Chris, the world would have had to blow up, and SCIDpda has to no longer exist. So that's when that's when this would come up. And so you'd have a world of hurt before you even get to that. So I think, although signing it makes you feel a little freaky, the real risk to you is pretty minimal. You've already given everything away by the time you get to this.
Mhm. You also, in talking about North Lot and the original layout of it, talked about having a development consultant for North Lot as sort of compared to what you're describing in this partnership with Community Roots. Can you talk a little bit about how, if that's different in relation to some of these conversations, or in relation to some of the program or control issues or financial risk issues that you're being put, that are now, are they 100% SCIDpda? Are they, how does that work?
Yeah. Um, uh, So I'm not sure of all the issues that are going to come up yet because we haven't got to financial closing, right? In all this. So, so understand that this conversation is coming from just closing, from what my attorneys and everybody has said, the most difficult project that everybody's worked on, the most complicated from a financial standpoint. And we're not even through. It's hard because for certain people, they're like, we're done. I'm like, nah, man, we're not done. We're not done until the people move in. We're entering the most risky time in some ways for us because you're a hole in the ground, right? Versus the North Lot where we're moving towards financial closing. Um, the the working with somebody else who's part ownership is interesting because I view that relationship very differently than how I view working with a development consultant. I view a joint development more like a marriage. But if you talk with people in a marriage, the two partners involved may look at things very differently as well. So I have to constantly reiterate, well, these are my values. What are your values? And when our teams get together, what are the values that we have and what are the goals that we have on this project and that joint development? And constantly having to reiterate, well, it's a joint development and I understand you're only 49%, but you're 49%. And if we were living at home, how'd you like it if I started a remodel on the bathroom without telling you, right? And it just like that versus a development consultant where they may disagree with what I want, but I ultimately get the say. I guess I ultimately have the say on the other side because I'm 51% until the investor flipped the decision making on us. But I view it very, very differently. And so we don't have to have that constant values check in between teams. It's all internally, which in some ways makes it a little bit easier. And so the number of people I have to communicate with is a little bit more controlled. But I have to kind of be much more clear. I have to be there's a lot of communication involved and why decisions are made. And I think that is actually the hardest thing. It's just the communications and the constant changing of the situation. And so I think choosing a development consultant who best meets the needs of the project is similar to choosing a joint development as to what you need. So you kind of need to know what you need and who best to help manage that. But today, if you were to ask me today, I think it's easier to work with a development consultant because they're working for you and they're supposed to understand what you need. You're supposed to have those conversations and you get to drive it a little bit more.
And that all balances too, right? With that means you sit with all the responsibility and all the risk
and all the financial
and all the
right?
financial piece, right? And so obviously as an organization,
right. And so I'm able to do that here at the North Law. I'm able to have that my balance sheet should theoretically, and maybe if it's not, I have to go out and get a guarantee and all this, right? And so we'll see how that goes. But it's a very, very different level of decision making and drive. And I think the financial piece, you should never underestimate what people are going to demand of you if you are the financial guarantor of this project. I have to have money that's sitting out that I can't touch for years, right? And maybe you don't have that ability and being told, you can't do this, right? That can be kind of hurtful a little bit, but at a certain point you're like, well, I guess I can't. So, what are my options? I could go find somebody else or not. And sometimes you don't have that option.
Yeah. I want to, given time, I want to make sure we open it up to the group for questions. Certainly feel free to unmute, or if you'd rather write your question in the chat and we will share those, please.
Kristen, did I say anything that surprised you or shocked you? Anything you want me to say?
No, I had mixed feelings on hoping you had found some like magic way to stay around for 85 years.
Dude, it's the Chin family that I'm married to that has like people living to 104. The Winklers die early.
Exactly.
We don't make it. Even with all that kale I'm eating, I'm sure it's not gonna make it that long. Yeah.
But no, I mean, I think that's you've hit on so many of the things that we've been talking about as a group of like why this is hard and difficult. And it's not, there isn't an easy guidebook that says start here, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. And I think,
No. And we
it's
haven't
different.
even gotten into the money part, right?
Yeah.
Like you want to build this thing and you can't get the money to align, or you can't find the money, or you're building the wrong kind of unit for your community. And, I mean, that was the nice thing about Yes Sir Family. They're like, we want you to build this housing program, which is great, which I think 5 years ago was probably at conflict with what the city of Seattle wanted to see. And with North Lot, the constant fighting of, no, I want more family units. Well, Maiko, it'll financially perform better if we have these studios. No, I want some 3-bedroom units. Well, it is better if we do this. No, I want this 3-bedroom unit, right? It's and then the city policy kind of changed a little bit, and they were just like, we're making a priority on family housing. I'm like, oh, yay. Now this should be easy, but that's only for that one funder. That's not for all the other funders who are really tied on unit count.
Well, and you're only, I mean, in those comments, you're talking specifically even just about like a residential unit program to a residential funder, much less than how do those stack with, right? What
Oh my
what are
God.
the multiple sources of childcare funding, and how do those even work together? Much
They
less how does
don't,
that work with
right?
a retail
Yeah,
funding with
yeah,
a
yeah.
housing funding?
Yeah, I had one delay on my closing for the childcare funding, and the state has become unusually problematic. They have a new source of funding which is supposed to be helpful. It's $800,000, and it held up a closing of an $80 million project. And every stall back ends up costing more money, right? So I'm just like, yeah, it's just
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Well, and the crazy part, but and then you have to redo a closing sheet again because one more day has passed and somebody
Oh
else
my
has come
God.
up with another, $37 that have to be included.
Yeah, and the rate
um,
went up for that little moment when you tried to rate lock, and that's going to cost you, I don't know, $150,000. Yeah, weird
um,
shit. Yeah,
question that about in a project like Yes Sir Family and sort of what we were just saying, are there
yeah.
tools to help fund the development of ground floor affordable commercial space for local retailers and restaurants? In your chart, you show that SCIDpda is sort of taking on the responsibility for the retail spaces there. How are you funding those? What are some of the sources?
So I earn theoretically this developer fee. That's what's going into the commercial space. And you kind of have to take that leap of faith. So in the past mayoral administration, the Office of Economic Development had money that was being targeted for small business grants. Um, I am hopeful that with some of the federal money coming down, federal money is not as limiting on commercial spaces as state and local funds. So, but it is a little bit, once again, a leap of faith. We've tried to build as much into the early components of it to make it functional. So it's like, okay, chances are probably good that there's going to be a food oriented thing in there. So let's make sure that we have all the venting and ducting built into the base construction budget. Whether you actually use it or not, it's always easier to think about what you're going to do in the commercial and how it's going to pop up through, then later on try to figure out how you do a Class A hood through that has to vent out the top, right? And all this. So try to build as much into that while your contractors are on site, and then just start having those conversations early. I would go to EDI. Hello, EDI. If you're here, I would go to the Office of Economic Development because they've done that before. And this is a special area for that. And we probably underwrite our commercial tenants differently than most other people because that's important to us. So it's figuring that out. Yeah.
And I want to just clarify, and I know Alicia's going to jump in to move us
Yeah.
over, but sort of I think when you say underwrite differently means not expecting that tenants are going to come with a huge rent, a huge capital source to do their build outs. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Maiko, but that's which makes it a lot harder because you don't have this thing that you can go to a bank ahead of time and say, hey, let me borrow $1 million to help get this ready for these tenants.
And if you're a small business, right, and we've used our balance sheet against stuff. If you're dealing with a sole proprietor, that's really risky. So a lot of the businesses in Chinatown are sole proprietorships. And in the last recession, the biggest loss of housing and assets for the API community was that sole proprietorships use their houses as leverage. I never want to be in the part of having a commercial tenant and having to go after them personally for their stuff. That to me is pretty awful. But let's also remember that somebody that's new starting a business cannot get a bank loan. Nobody's going to lend to them. Maybe Craft 3 will because they got that Mackenzie Bezos money. But for a small business that's looking at a 12% interest rate on a loan, that's kind of crazy, right? And so how do we deal with that sort of situation? It is, but that's kind of who we want to see there.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of do that, right? You got to kind of do the dance.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Maiko. This is Melissa with NDC.
Okay. I'm hearing a voice. Just kidding. I'm hearing voices
So
now.
you've obviously been doing this for a while, and you've kind of talked about how these are long-term relationships, and ideally, the people that you're embarking on these long-term partnerships with.
Yeah.
I'm curious what advice you would have for people who are starting out and maybe looking at their first project, kind of what you'd recommend they do as they're just starting.
So Melissa, I don't know when you're talking about long-term like projects, like what point in the project it is. I mean, from my house, if I were to stand up, I could look down on a project that's yet incomplete. It's a large site that NDC was involved in that I worked on when I was fresh out of graduate school in 1996. It's a multi-phase project and it's still not done. And I was a young woman and didn't have a child when that happened, right? I mean, so some of these projects go a long time. So when you say project life, I don't know what people think of as project life. I can think about it a long time. I think if you are thinking about embarking on something like this, you should start developing those relationships early. And if you don't have the time to do that, then you work with people who have done this stuff early to help you flesh out what some of these things mean or what these relationships are like. Also being very cognizant of what Kristen tried to bring up, like relationships are with people, but how do you make it with the organization? And knowing that these organizations change over time. The Seattle Housing Authority, who I started this conversation with Andrew Lofton, the Seattle Housing Authority has gone through 2 executive directors in the time that I've been thinking about this Yes Sir Family project. The Pacific Hospital PDA had a change in executive directors. That AI PACE program has gone from a four nonprofit group to a 2 nonprofit group to perhaps a 1 nonprofit group. And one of those partners has switched EDs like 3 times. What does that mean? And how do how does that work? And so it is a constant thing that you have to constantly be working at. But I do think that there are a lot of people that have been around that you should go and pick their brain, because I think there's a lot of people who really believe in community development, which is very different than affordable housing, right? Let's be very clear on that. It's very different than affordable housing, and who are willing to talk with people and want to help people do this work and have more of this sort of stuff happen. So you got to, I know it's kind of hard in COVID, but you got to go out and have coffees and chat and pick people's brains and talk about it, I think, in a different way, because it's years in the making.
Alicia, I think we are going to turn it over so that Sarah can run our poll. I want to thank everybody for joining us today, especially Maiko. So wonderful to see you. And thank you for sharing.
This is what I look like outside of COVID.
Your, your history and experiences with this group. I think these are part of the starts of how that is so valuable in creating the community that we're trying to create with the Lunch and Learns, is sort of understanding what's out there and the people who are out there.
If anybody has questions, you can just call me.
You're definitely one of those fabulous people who is out there and is incredibly gracious with your time and sharing your experience around it. So
I'm not that smart and I'm dying, so it's okay. Yeah, it's fine.
We are continuing some of these topics at our Real Estate 102 in June. So as the follow-on to the 101, there is a 102 series that's happening June 8th, 9th, 10th. Am I getting those dates right, Alicia? And if you want to join, still kind of speaking to this intersection of land and program and money and how do they work together and where do you start and where do you end and how do you keep staying on the roller coaster, merry-go-round, whatever analogy we'd use for it. But Maiko, thank you again. I hope to see you in person soon.
I'll put my email in the chat. So
Great,
if
thank
anybody
you.
wants to do that. And you know what, if I don't respond, just ping me again, because I'll be honest, I have a kid that's going off to college. I got a dog, I got these projects, but just because I don't respond doesn't mean that I don't care, because I love, we all should be thinking about community development because that's the way that we get to stay in our communities. So I'll just leave it with that.
Yeah.
Oops, that's my AOL. You don't want that. Try that. Yeah. All right. Kristen, it's always great to see you. I'm hoping for a beverage at
Yes.
sometime fun and soon.
Soon.
Yes.
Thank you both. Sarah, do you want to lead us through the poll?
Yes, I'm going to do my best. Before I do that, again, I want to echo my thanks to Kristen and Maiko. Maiko in particular, you are a treasure trove of wisdom and experience and great humor. So glad that we get to have you here today. I'm going to try this polling tool for the first time. Heads up to everybody, may or may not work. We're going to give it a shot. So in the chat, you should see a link that you can click on or copy and paste into your browser window and click on. And it's going to bring up a poll question. And I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can see as responses start to come in. So you can either respond through that link or you can text as well, if that's easier for you. All right, give a moment and I will share my screen with everybody. Hopefully I'm sharing the right thing. Do you folks see that? Responses coming in? I need someone to respond to me out loud. Okay, thank you.
I see them. This looks great.
Yes.
Great. So we're asking folks to use a word or a phrase to describe what went well that you'd like to see more of. Love that we're seeing great show up multiple times. Sounds like folks really love being able to hear about, real experience of community development projects and partnerships that are happening in community, testimonial, relationships, knowledgeable examples, storytelling. That it's complicated, absolutely. Which is why having these insights, right, is so helpful. Honest, that's coming up a lot. Maiko always does bring the honesty.
I think the term that my marketing department likes to say, like Joseph Guanlau likes to say, is you're authentic. The good, the bad, and the ugly.
See, and that's the art of storytelling and crafting messaging. But it's true, you are authentic. Okay, wonderful. Let's go to the next question. See if I can do that. So now you should be able to submit an answer to this question of using a word or phrase to describe what you'd like to change for next time. Because we will have these lunch and learns almost every month, except for next month when we have the Real Estate 102 course, and then in October when we're going to have an asset management course. So the next lunch and learn will be in July. Lessons learned. Okay.
Ooh,
Networking.
you guys are going to do an asset management course?
We are.
Oh, I think that's huge. That's something we didn't get into, because once you build it, you got to run it. And nobody seems to think about that.
It's so hard to get to that point.
Well, and going through, we're doing all of our CNAs, capital needs assessments. And I'm like, really? It's time to do that? And they're like, yeah, Maiko, it's been 15 years. I'm like, oh God, have I been here that long? I guess I have. Just, yeah, the planning for that.
Absolutely. And we're seeing folks chime in with feedback on opportunities for networking. That seems really huge. And I think that that connects a lot to the themes of today, right? Around relationships, the importance of being able to share experience with each other, insights, questions. BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. I'm seeing STEP here. Is that talking about the steps of the process that folks want to dig into more? If anybody who put that wants to unmute themselves and elaborate on that, it would be welcome, or else you're always welcome to email us and share the feedback directly. Okay, we've got 2 more questions. So I'm just gonna keep this up for 10 more seconds, and then we're gonna stop sharing and we're gonna go to a Zoom poll that's gonna ask folks to share what kind of topics they'd like to see in future Lunch and Learns. Great. Hearing more from developers, numbers, providers. Okay, thank you for sharing, everybody. I'm gonna stop sharing this one. I'm gonna move to the Zoom poll now, which is a different format. So now you're all going to see a poll pop up on your screen. And if folks could please indicate which topics you'd like to see for future Lunch and Learn events, that'd be very helpful. You can select more than one, but this will allow us to curate future offerings. I'll leave it open for just about a little less than a minute, and then I'll end the poll and share results. I see someone chiming in on chat, Marcia, saying all of the above. Some of you may feel that way, that you would like all of the above. Leave it open for 10 more seconds. All right, I'm gonna share results now so that everyone can see. So it looks like quite a lot of interest in hearing more partnership examples and project stories, for sure. Learning more about tax credit financing, conversations with developers, the asset management, construction financing. Wonderful. So this is really helpful feedback for us. And then the last thing we want to ask is, are there any topics that were not on this list that you're interested in discussing and diving into at these Lunch and Learns? If so, please put them in the chat. And if you can't think of them now, but you think of them 5 minutes after we end, the email for Melissa and for Alicia are in the chat as well. And you are always welcome to email us and let us know.
And feel free to also let us know if there are specific people or specific projects that you think would be great for this and want to hear from.
Wonderful. And I think that's it for my section. I'll turn it back over to Alicia, I think.
Yeah, I think we're done for today. Thank you so much for coming. Again, we don't have a Lunch and Learn next month, but there will be an email coming out about the 3-afternoon workshop coming up in June. And we will have some more guest speakers during that workshop, and Kristen will lead it, focusing on land, program, and money in your community real estate development project. So thank you all. Have a wonderful day.